Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Nina and today we're going to have a look at the mind-muscle connection and if it is actually helpful for building strength and gaining muscle. The reason I'm bringing this up now is because I've seen it a lot lately. I've heard of the mind-muscle connection before, but I mostly associated it with the bodybuilding community. However, I noticed that the mind-muscle connection has become a popular concept in the more mainstream fitness industry as well. In fact, the mind-muscle connection is even promoted as a new form of progressive overload to build more muscle and gain more strength. And that's why I decided to have a look at it myself to see if there is actually some truth to this claim according to the latest scientific literature. The earliest research on this topic investigated the effect of the mind-muscle connection on performance in different sports, such as golfing, skiing, soccer, and basketball. Gabriele Wolf, who is a distinguished professor in kinesiology and nutrition science at the University of Nevada, wrote a comprehensive review about this topic, which summarized more than 80 different studies. All of these 80 studies looked at whether an external focus or an internal focus, i.e. the mind-muscle connection, would result in better learning and performance in these different sports. And virtually all of the examined studies found that an external focus is better for sports performance and for learning new skills compared to an internal focus. Meaning that when you want to learn how to play basketball, for example, or you want to become better at it, the mind-muscle connection is not really helpful and might even hinder your progress. However, these findings were very sport and task specific, and many coaches and researchers alike wondered if this also applies to the weight room. To investigate this issue, Brad Schoenfield and colleagues conducted a small study to find out whether an internal or external focus would influence strength gains over an 8-week training program. To induce an internal focus, the researchers told the participants to focus on squeezing the muscle during the exercise. And to induce an external focus, the researchers told them to just get the weight up. After 8 weeks, the strength gains on the biceps curl and the leg extension were similar between both groups, indicating that the mind-muscle connection did not have any influence whatsoever on strength gains. This finding was supported by a meta-analysis from last year conducted by Gergic, Mikulic, and Mikulic. These three researchers looked at and summarized the findings of 10 different studies on that topic. They found that for exercises like the squats, deadlifts, and leg extensions, having an external focus, i.e. to focus on just getting the weight up, is beneficial for strength gains in the short term. However, in the long term, an external and internal focus resulted in the same strength gains, similar to what was observed by Schoenfield and colleagues. Therefore, the mind-muscle connection seems to be irrelevant for strength gains. The same conclusions were also drawn by Newman in his 2019 review. He looked at the results of a total of 16 studies and found that an external focus may result in superior performance to allow the athlete to lift a heavier weight than may otherwise be possible. The so-called constrained action hypothesis also delivers an explanation as to why the mind-muscle connection might be disadvantageous for strength gains. Using an internal focus of attention leads the individual to focus only on one component of the movement. However, movements in many exercise tasks are achieved by an integration of many muscles. In essence, the narrow focus that comes with having a strong mind-muscle connection limits your ability to exert force and therefore limits your ability to shift heavy weights. So far, we've established that the mind-muscle connection is irrelevant or even slightly disadvantageous when learning new skills or sports and for gaining strength. However, originally coming from and being popular in bodybuilding circles, the mind-muscle connection was probably never meant to be beneficial for these two measures, but rather for muscle hypertrophy. And I think I know where this idea comes from. There are plenty of studies investigating whether focusing on a specific muscle during exercise, i.e. having a good mind-muscle connection improves muscle activation. For example, a 2018 study had 18 young men perform bench presses with 50% of their 1 rep max. The participants were doing the exercise with 3 different focuses. No specific focus, focusing on their pecs, or focusing on their triceps. While the participants were doing the exercise, the researchers measured muscle activation of the pecs and of the triceps by electromyography, or EMG. They found that compared to the no-focus condition, the pecs were more active when focusing on the pecs, and the triceps was more active when focusing on the triceps. In essence, they showed that the mind-muscle connection can increase muscle activation as measured by EMG. And this is by far not the only study. The same results were found in other studies for the bench press and also for push-ups. Therefore, when looking at all of these studies, it seems natural to assume that the mind-muscle connection is beneficial for muscle growth, right? Well, I'm not so sure about this, because there are some caveats. For one, the increased muscle activation when focusing on a specific muscle only seems to work between 20 and 60% of your 1 rep max. When training with higher loads, such as 80% of your 1 rep max, there is no preferential muscle activation anymore. The second issue has to do with the measurement itself and the conclusions that we draw from it. Simply put, EMG measures the electrical signals in your muscle which precede and are necessary for muscle contraction. As such, one can say that EMG measures muscle activation. And there's a rather popular hypothesis which assumes that higher signals measured with EMG results in higher muscle activation, which then leads to higher rates of muscle protein synthesis, which leads to more muscle hypertrophy. And that's why many researchers used EMG signals as a proxy for measuring muscle growth. However, reality may not be as straightforward as we used to think. In order to build muscle, muscle protein synthesis must exceed muscle protein breakdown. However, although muscle protein synthesis is elevated for up to 6 hours after a workout, the extent of muscle protein synthesis is not directly correlated to the amount of muscle gain after 16 weeks of resistance training. Furthermore, a muscle does not need to be excited for growth to occur. In fact, a hypertrophic response can be elicited in denervated muscle by applying mechanical tension. Of course, you won't pack on a lot of muscle mass simply by stretching. But this further questions how accurately muscle activation can predict muscle growth in the long term. And in fact, all of these EMG studies I mentioned earlier recorded all data in a single session, and the researchers never followed up with the participants to see if they actually gained muscle mass. And that's why many researchers in the field now argue to interpret EMG results very cautiously, because at present it is unclear as to whether or not greater EMG amplitudes are indeed associated with greater hypertrophy, strength, or with improvements in functional motor tasks. In fact, no study has demonstrated such effects with clarity. But there is one study that didn't rely on EMG to assess if the mind-muscle connection leads to more muscle hypertrophy. This study was conducted by Schoenfield and colleagues in 2018. In their study, 30 untrained men were split into 2 groups, the internal and the external focus group. Both groups trained 3 times per week for a total of 8 weeks. And in their workouts, the participants did 4 sets of 8 to 12 reps of each biceps curls and leg extensions. The men in the internal focus group were told to focus on squeezing their muscles, while the external focus group was told to focus on moving the weight up. After 8 weeks, the biceps of the internal group grew by 12.4% on average, while the biceps of the external group only gained 6.9% in size. This would suggest that the mind-muscle connection was actually beneficial for muscle growth in this case. However, no such difference in muscle size was observed between the two groups for the quads. The author speculated that the difficulty for untrained individuals to establish a mind-muscle connection in the thigh musculature likely produced these different outcomes. However, overall, the mind-muscle connection has only been shown to increase muscle activation, but that doesn't necessarily translate into muscle growth. Therefore, the scientific evidence to support the mind-muscle connection as a driver of muscle hypertrophy is very weak, to say the least. After reading through all these studies and reviews, it became clear that the mind-muscle connection is irrelevant when it comes to practicing a new skill or gaining strength. After all, an external focus, such as focusing on just getting the weight up, seems to be much more effective for getting stronger. And it also makes sense. Taking the squat as an example, there are multiple joints and muscles involved. So focusing on only the mind-muscle connection with the quads, for example, is limiting and possibly also counterproductive. When it comes to muscle hypertrophy, i.e. the building of muscle mass, things get a bit more complicated. So far, most studies measured muscle activation by EMG as a proxy for muscle growth. However, at present, it is not clear if EMG is a reliable measure of muscle hypertrophy. So all these studies really showed is that the mind-muscle connection tends to activate muscles better, but if this also translates into more muscle gains is currently unknown. There is one study which linked the mind-muscle connection to increased muscle hypertrophy over the course of 8 weeks. But it is only one study, and it only worked for a single muscle, the biceps, and only in a total of 15 men. So at this point, whether or not the mind-muscle connection enhances muscle growth is still unclear. And I think that having a good mind-muscle connection is not necessary for building muscle and gaining strength. I also want to acknowledge that the mind-muscle connection can be useful in some cases. For example, to find out if you're doing an exercise correctly. Let's take the hip thrust as an example. Trying to feel your glutes can be helpful to check if your glutes are actually doing most of the work or if your quads and lower back are taking over. But again, just because I don't feel a certain muscle during an exercise doesn't mean it's not working. For example, I usually don't feel my biceps during biceps curls, but I know that it is actually the most active muscle and probably also the single active muscle during this exercise. To sum it all up, in order to maximize strength and muscle gains, it is most important to focus on factors like suitable exercise selection, good technique, going through a full range of motion, progressive overload, and training close to failure. If that foundation is in place, then maybe the mind-muscle connection might help a tiny bit with further increasing muscle growth. But the scientific evidence to support the benefits of a mind-muscle connection for muscle hypertrophy is simply not here yet. Therefore, in my opinion, the mind-muscle connection is overhyped. So, and that was it for today. I really hope you learned something new and you liked this video. And if you did, then please give me a thumbs up. Also consider subscribing to my channel to see more videos like this in the future, and consider clicking the notification bell next to it so you get notified when I upload my next video. Having said this, I hope you have an amazing day and I see you in the next video. Bye!